And so, yes, people are very fearful that the institutions of power in the United States have been infected with these motives and that it has poisoned all of those institutions. Start with big tech. So there's a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago from our friend Vivek Ramaswamy and Jed Rubenfeld of Yale talking about Alex Berenson. So Alex Berenson, he's now back on Twitter after being banned for nearly a year over COVID-19 misinformation. Last week, the former New York Times reporter settled his lawsuit against the social media company, which admitted error and then restored his account. The First Amendment doesn't apply to private companies like Twitter, Berenson wrote last week on Substack, but because the Biden administration brought pressure to bear on Twitter, he believes he has a case his constitutional rights were violated. He is correct. So what exactly happened here? Well, Berenson went through the discovery process ensuing Twitter, and that discovery process confirmed that the White House has been secretly asking social media companies to shut down the contents of specific prominent critics of administration policy. On July 16th, 2021, a reporter asked President Biden, quote, on COVID misinformation, what's your message to platforms like Facebook? And Biden replied, quote, they are killing people. Later that day, Twitter locked Berenson's account. On August 28th, it banned him permanently. Last Friday, Berenson published conversations from an internal Twitter Slack channel referring to an April 2021 meeting with White House officials. One Twitter employee noted that the meeting overall was pretty good, but added the White House had one really tough question about why Alex Berenson hasn't been kicked off the platform. Another employee asked, any high-level takeaways from the meeting? Anything we should keep an eye out for? The first employee responded, yes. They really wanted to know about Alex Berenson. The employee wrote that Andy Slavitt, then a senior White House COVID advisor, quote, suggested they had seen data that had showed that he was the epicenter of disinformation that radiated outwards to the persuadable public. Berenson was not the only target. At a July 15th, 2021 meeting, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said, quote, we're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vax misinformation on social media platforms. This was a reference to the so-called Disinformation Dozen, 12 named individuals identified in a report by the UK-based Center for Countering Digital Hate, a report that Facebook disputed even as it said it had taken action against the targets. Psaki went on to say that 12 of them remained active on Facebook despite some being banned on other platforms, including ones that Facebook owns. At the same briefing, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy called on social media companies to purge more COVID posts. He said, we're asking them to consistently take action against misinformation super spreaders on their platform. And a week later, Nick Clegg, a former UK deputy prime minister and now Facebook parent Meta's president for global affairs, emailed Murthy to thank him for meeting with Facebook and to report on the steps we took just this past week to further address the Disinformation Dozen. We removed 17 additional pages, groups, and Instagram accounts tied to the Disinformation Dozen, resulting in every member having had at least one such entity removed. So you now have the White House overtly coordinating with the biggest platforms to effectuate policy changes by silencing critics, by silencing voices. And this didn't stop in 2020. Nick Clegg has now put out a statement this week talking about what Facebook is going to do for the 2022 U.S. midterm elections. And here's what he has to say. He says, our approach to the 2022 midterm elections applies learnings from the 2020 election cycle and exceeds the measures we implemented during the last midterm election in 2018. This includes advanced security operations to fight foreign interference and domestic influence campaigns, our network of independent fact-checking partners. Those independent fact-checking partners are universally left-wing, and when they fact-check, what they actually do is they implication check. So if you say something that is true, Snopes will say, mostly false. He'll say, yeah, well, you said it's true, sure, but the implication is mostly false. Our industry-leading transparency measures around political advertising and pages, as well as new measures to help keep poll workers safe. As we did in 2020, we have a dedicated team in place to combat election and voter interference, while also helping people get reliable information about when and how to vote. Nick Clegg says our teams fight both foreign interference and domestic influence operations and have exposed and disrupted dozens of networks that have attempted to interfere with U.S. elections. And some of this is about preventing Russia from intervening. But the second thing is about downgrading particular information. Remember, it was Facebook and it was Nick Clegg who originally said, yeah, you know what we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to suppress this New York Post story. So all those institutions of power are perfectly willing to suppress information on behalf of a particular political cause or at the behest of the White House. And this is why people are deeply suspicious of the FBI search on Donald Trump's home, because institutional trust is at all-time lows, as well it should be. Once the motive has been said, it cannot be unsaid. Once you say your motive out loud, the bell cannot be unrung. And so what we are learning right now is, and then you have, the FBI trotting out disgraced former agents like Peter Strzok saying, trust us. We don't. So Peter Strzok, who you'll recall, was caught in a text messaging scandal with one of his subordinates. He was screwing her. They were both married. And they were texting one another about how much they hated Donald Trump throughout the investigation that he was leading into both Hillary Clinton and the 2016 emails. And he was also leading the investigation into Trump and the Trump-Russia collusion kind of stuff. Now, Peter Strzok ended up being fired unceremoniously. He's disgraced himself. But now he's back to explain that, for example, the affidavit in the FBI raid on Trump's house should not be released. Why? Well, he says, well, it reveals sources and methods. Okay, invariably, the people who are calling for lack of transparency in these particular types of cases are the people you probably shouldn't trust. Here's Peter Strzok.
Do you think any part of the affidavit should be revealed?
No, and I'd be surprised if it was. In any other case not involving a former president of the United States, I'd expect the judge to rule immediately at the conclusion of the presentations from both sides. He may, in this case, because of the significant nature of the case, want to go and draft an opinion and make sure all the T's are crossed and I's dotted. But ordinarily, I would not expect to have it released, and I would expect to have an order or decision out of the judge during this hearing.
And the people in the media are like, oh, yeah, that's fine. Lack of transparency. Fine with us. Weird, because you guys were all for massive transparency when it comes to, for example, police officers involved in controversial shootings. Then you want the tape yesterday. But when it comes to, for example, surveillance footage of the FBI going through Donald Trump's belongings, then you got Peter Strzok out there on CNN saying, yeah, no, we definitely can't. And I mean, that tape should not be available to the general public. I mean, it's only the most controversial single FBI action of the last, 40 years or so.
My main concern is one of physical security for the agents and other personnel involved in the search. If these are images where people can be identified, where they can have a name identified along with their image, that obviously in the context of what we're looking at now with threats to the judge, with threats to FBI personnel and offices, that really heightens the risk to those agents and other personnel who took part in that search. From an optics perspective, Trump and his camp are talking a big game about releasing it, but I have some question about whether an average American viewer watching FBI agents walk out with box after box after box of highly classified information, whether that in fact is an image that is going to serve Trump very well.
Yeah, so again, it's not a big deal. You shouldn't worry about it. Just trust us. Garrett Graff has a piece over at the New York Times today. He's the author of a book called Watergate, A New History. He has an op-ed at the New York Times today talking about how basically the right should leave the FBI alone because the FBI is generally conservative. He says, historically, the FBI has been arguably the most culturally conservative and traditionally white Christian institution in the entire U.S. government. It's an institution so culturally conservative, even by the standards of law enforcement, that Democratic presidents have never felt comfortable or politically emboldened enough to nominate a Democrat to head the Bureau. That's right, far from being a bastion of progressive thinking, every single director of the FBI has been a Republican-aligned official going all the way back to its creation. Such history suggests that the issue here is Mr. Trump and not institutional bias. So the idea here is that, all you guys are complaining about the FBI. What are you complaining about? What are you complaining about? After all, they're your people. Well, I mean, there's only one problem with that, and that is the institutional forces inside all of these institutions, including the FBI, if they're congenitally predisposed at the top levels against Donald Trump, and if that's being approved by the DOJ under Merrick Garland, I'm not sure what that says about the everyday agent sitting behind his desk. I mean, this is the same sort of complaint that you hear. So the right will say, we are very critical of the leadership of the U.S. military. A lot of the leaders of the U.S. military have bought into sort of the woke, progressive, equity-based agenda with regard to the United States military. They are wokeifying the military, and it's really stupid, and it's undermining combat readiness. And the left will go, well, yeah, but you guys love the military. The military is filled with people who agree with you. Well, yes, throughout the military, but at the very top levels, the way that you become a top-level general in the military is by being political. The grunts on the ground know this. Everybody, you talk to anybody in any branch of the military, and what they will tell you is once you hit the upper levels of the political echelon of the military, you're a political general. You got up there because you're very good at politicking. The same thing happens to be true with the upper levels of the FBI. So just because the average FBI agent may be politically conservative doesn't change whether the FBI has at its top levels a bunch of politicians who are maneuvering, because that's what happens in every bureaucracy. And so, again, trust us tends to go by the wayside when you have undermined your own trust. And this, I keep saying that it's true in every institution. This is why it feels like the country is breaking, even though the United States is still the most powerful force on planet Earth by a wide margin. Okay, China cannot challenge the United States. The United States is a massively powerful economy. The United States has the most powerful military in world history. The United States is a powerhouse. It is a global hegemon. And yet we are talking about the kind of breakup of the United States in terms of social fabric. And the reason is because all the institutions that used to unify us are now falling apart because you can't trust the guy in charge because his motives seem to be wrong. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date with all our future content.